The Bible reading for today is found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 14 to 22, reading from the New International Version. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. Parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their parents. Each will die for their own sin. Do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this.
Thank you so much for that reading. The book of Deuteronomy can look overwhelming in its, we'll just wait till we get the audio right, can look overwhelming in its lists of rules and codes, but when we stop and see just that treasured gem of what it can look like to provide for others, I think we're greatly encouraged. So this morning, as we mentioned before, is my last message here at Hughes Baptist. That makes me a bit sad, actually. It's been such a joy to share with you all. And I have to tell you, at my workplace, I brag about you all the time. Because people will ask how I'm settling into Canberra. You know, new place, cold place. I came in June last year. It's a bit overwhelming. And I explain, I went to church on my first Sunday and the church just loved me. And then I usually explain, that it's not because of any particular character quality that I might have, but that this is a church and that's what we do. It's my pleasure now to explore chapter 2 of Ruth, and after Glendon's introduction to this wonderful story last week. I was just sharing with Mike before, I think one of the things we probably love about Ruth is you can actually read it in one sitting. It's a story you can sort of get your arms around and get a sense of in a quick step, but actually when you slow down, there's so many beautiful gems to be found. We'll see if we find some of those this morning. All right, so we'll get going as we read through this great passage. Now, and I'm just reading to make sure they're the same. Excellent, they are. We're on the right track. Now it says, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So our reading this morning was from Deuteronomy 24, and it's an important insight into society of how it provides for the poor. If we'd also taken a look, sliding a bit over to Leviticus chapter 25, we'd also read a few verses that talk about how land that had been sold could essentially be, you had first dibs to buy it back if you were from the family that was allocated that land. So throughout this, some of these dense words of the first 5 books of the Bible, there are these wonderful rules that actually God has set up to allow for a bit more equal sharing of the wealth of the land and the produce that it has. and recognising that people fall in their circumstances. It only takes a job loss or a death, as we see, for things to unravel. But there were processes in place, at least if they were working, so that people could get back their property and therefore their way of earning a living. So therefore we can reasonably assume that Elimelech had sold his property, given that he had left Bethlehem for Moab, because he'd lost his ability to earn a living. And so this system of getting land back to the family was a great equaliser if people were following the rules. Now, we read the book of Ruth alongside the book of Judges, where we understand that not everyone was following the rules as they might have been. So if Naomi came back without a male relative at her side, the ability to get her land back and then make a living off that would have been severely limited, I would suggest. You just don't have the kind of strength to back up what the property rights are. All right, so verse 2. And Ruth and Moab, the Moabites, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." Okay, so this statement tells us that Ruth has learnt about the Jewish customs from Naomi, and the author doesn't want us to forget that Ruth is a Moabite. The author keeps bringing it up all the time. Like, the Moabite, did you know? Like, yes, you have mentioned it several times. And what I think we can infer is we're meant to underestimate Ruth. She's just a Moabite or one of those people. It's almost got that tone for it in that culture. But in this statement, we learn that Ruth has got a bit of get up and go. She's not waiting for a handout. She's not so foolish as just to kind of sit there and see what might happen. She's like, we've got to go and make some things happen. All right, so we continue. Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Okay, let's pay attention to that phrase, "as it turns out." Now, I want to confess something to you. When things go well for me, I generally think, well, that went well. Excellent. I'm not sure that I think often enough, God is good and God is looking out for me and he has brought the circumstances together in this way that it might go well. I wish I did that. I'm not sure I do enough. But in the story of Ruth, it's a story of God's loving kindness to his people, yes? And we're seeing this example that not all miracles and gifts from God are fantastical and brilliant and, loaves and fishes multiplying and billboards announcing what God wants us to do. They can be quite humble and circumstantial. And it does cause me to wonder, and perhaps you might, if we might not benefit from stopping to recognise that sometimes, as it happens, as it goes well, that God's hand may truly be in that moment. All right, so from verse 4. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite." No one forgets, do they? Anyway, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Okay. You all know me, right? So I think you'll forgive me if I admit, as a 21st century reader, reading the phrase, "Who does that young woman belong to?" is deeply irritating. This is a condescending phrase, right? But the thing is, The phrase was accurate. At that time, as in many times for women, a woman belonged to her husband or to her father. And we know that Ruth doesn't have either, certainly present. So what should be answered simply is not simple, it's a bit more of a complicated answer. And so the overseer had to explain her circumstances and how she came to be in that field. So from verse 8, we read, "So Boaz said to Ruth, 'My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled.'" So, for a woman who didn't have a protector, Boaz stepped up. He called her daughter. He took responsibility for her employment and her safety. The employment was somewhat his obligation, but he went further than what was required, using his authority to ensure her physical protection and tasking his employees to retrieve her water. So we read from verse 10. "At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, 'Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?' Boaz replied, 'I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.'" Boaz was impressed with Ruth because of her courage, loyalty, and faith in the people of Israel. Can I just take another cheeky moment? I know you're getting a little bit of Karen right here, but I want to contrast this to another patriarch, and this is not in any of the commentaries, okay? I just noticed this. So Jacob happened upon Rachel the shepherdess one day. Another coincidence? And he fell in love because, wait for it folks, wait for it, Genesis 29:17. Rachel was beautiful in figure and appearance. Team Boaz, I think, is team substance. May it be said of us as well. All right, back to it. Verse 13. "May I continue to find favour in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she had sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull up some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." Again, Boaz went beyond what was required. He didn't have to give her lunch. She was not entitled to catering. He certainly didn't need to deliberately leave extra grain on the ground. What fell accidentally was enough according to the laws and customs, and we're not even positive that they were being followed widely in that community. So Boaz went further. This is a challenge, I think, in our own lives. It gives us an opportunity to reflect. We have mechanisms, I think, to meet our obligations, to pay tax, to visit family, to go to church even. But could we look for ways, even unexpected ways, to go further than our obligations, be they legal or social, to give more to those who are particularly in need of God's gracious care and kindness? It's something to think about. So from verse 17. "So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. The catering, remember? So the ephah was about 13 kilos. That's a good haul. Actually, carrying that back home would have been a bit heavy after a while. One bag, two, how do you carry this thing? But it was certainly worth it, wasn't it? Okay, so from verse 19, her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I was at work with today was Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "This man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Just reading this story this week, something that struck me as curious, I hadn't really noticed before, was that Naomi didn't send Ruth explicitly to work in one of the fields of her relatives. At least that's what we get from the story. I wonder if, having come back from Bethlehem, remember she changed her name and basically called herself Bitter? She was pretty deflated. And perhaps she had low expectations of the kind of charity and provision that she could expect from the male relatives who owned the land from her clan. Maybe the transaction back when they left didn't go well. Maybe as they left, people didn't wish them well. They didn't understand why they were leaving. But in this statement, we see she is very happy to have been proved wrong. She saw that Boaz had provided. She was able to genuinely find joy in the generous charity that she had received. That's a quick turnaround from where she was only, a day or two ago, according to this narrative, and a wonderful one. So from verse 21, then Ruth the Moabite said, "He said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.' Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed.'" It's a good moment to acknowledge we're not reading a Disney fairy tale. Naomi spoke really plainly a conversation women have been having forever. Go here, not there. Talk to him, not to him. There are spaces that are safe and there are spaces that are not. And sometimes the spaces that are not still need to be faced in order to make a living and to make one's way in the world. But Ruth, for now, has a place to earn a living that is free from danger under the protection of a righteous man who is taking responsibility for her. So from verse 23. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So after good fortune of a safe, well-paying work, there was more work. Every day of the harvest season, Ruth got up, presumably very early, sorry about that, to work in a field and bring back the takings that she had to her mother-in-law. This was a woman who had inspired Ruth with her love of Israel's kind and loving God. It would have been hard work, but good work. And each night they would have thanked their God in heaven for his provision, delivered through the oversight of Boaz. In this next stage of the story, we have learned of God's loving kindness enabled through the man Boaz. Wouldn't that be a glorious thing to be said of you and me? That people know the loving kindness of God because of us. For those who've experienced of Christian faith feels like it's academic or ritualistic, this is God's call to extend his character through action. And it's a really interesting and fun challenge, I think. You know, Micah explored what this would look like. People were confusing their religious obligations for rituals and prayers and membership. And he had a different prophecy to give. In Micah 6, we read these words: "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings and calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with the thousands of rams or tens of rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn of my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Less about rituals and prayers, although they were important and needed to be followed, and more about the actions towards those who so needed a very human expression of God's love and care. If we gallop ahead into the New Testament, Colossians 3 explores what the people of God should look like. We're people who should turn away from sin and set our eyes on God. People who are recognisable because of our Christ-like character revealed in our actions. In verse 12 it says this: "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with one another and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity." There's work to do, but it's fun work. It's good work. The work of kindness and generosity. And finally, in Ephesians 4, as Christians are exhorted to maturity in their faith. So this is what mature Christian living looks like. Verse 32, "Be compassionate, kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." This call to loving kindness is not the initial step of what it looks like to be a follower of God, and in our language today, a Christian, that we then sort of graduate from and get more serious as we, collect more commentaries on our bookshelf or something. It's an essential ingredient of genuine worship, Christian identity, and spiritual maturity for all of us. And so it is my prayer for each and every one of us, particularly say in the coming week, because I don't know if anyone else can think much further than that, to reflect joy, courage, and loving kindness, because these are the characteristics of God that have been modelled to us in this wonderful story we've heard this morning in the lives of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. I'll leave it there.